Greetings all, this is Rick Levine with your mid-month update for May of 2020. Before we get to the material, I have a couple of quick announcements. First of all, I would like to thank all of you Patreoners who are supporting these videos. And I just want to mention that we're making the mid-month video, which is normally only available to subscribers, still available to everyone just because of the intensity of these times. And I think it's really important to get the information out there. So feel free to share this video as you would. That would be great. Second of all, of course, if you're interested in helping support these videos and finding out about other videos that I do, you can check that out at Patreon, P-A-T-R-E-O-N, patreon.com/Rick Levine. Also, my daily updates, kind of like blogs, but they're cosmic weather reports, overviews, are available on Instagram, and that's the Instagram account is Rick Levine Astrologer on Instagram. And so I wanted to get those announcements out of the way. Secondly, my speaking schedule is still changing because of the changing conditions out there. The Toronto event that I was going to be doing on June 5th through 7th, that's a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, has been moved to a virtual event. And having done now several of these events, they're quite engaging and they seem to work really well. Just did a week-long event with Kai Pacha and other astrologers that were going to be down in Costa Rica. And we had nearly 300 people attending, and it was a lot of fun and a lot of good astrology. So the Toronto event is June 5th through the 7th, June 5 through 7, and that's Friday night, Saturday, Sunday. Friday night will be a deep dive into reincarnation and its relationship and its role to astrology. In fact, we'll be looking at this from a perspective of reincarnation and disincarnation, incarnation, disincarnation, birth and death. And we'll be digging into a little bit of some of the concepts that are being used in evolutionary astrology, the use of the nodes and Pluto in particular, but also some of the ideas that feed this and why this is so important for us astrologers. On Saturday, we're going to be doing hands-on chart readings. We'll go through my material on what I call my 12 steps to doing better chart readings. And this is some of my basic teachings. If you're interested in learning how to look at charts or read charts, as long as you have some knowledge of the planet signs and houses, so that you're not totally lost, we're going to really dig in and see what it's like to do charts and how to go about figuring them out and how to go about putting it all together. On Sunday, we're going to be digging into relationships and relationship astrology techniques. And this is a vast field, but we'll kind of touch enough of it so that we have a way of orienting ourselves as astrologers to what can we use astrology for and how do we better decipher and figure out the whole relationship dynamics that we all live with. And then on Sunday afternoon, we'll do some synthesis and put the whole thing together. Information can be found at astrologytoronto.com. Link is down there. And because it's no longer restricted by the physical space of being in Toronto, the registration is open, and so check that out if you are so interested. And I also just want to mention in passing, many of you know that I teach a retreat, lead a retreat or workshop in Bali every year, and we have one scheduled for December 5th through the 15th. At this time, I'm assuming that's going to be a go. Obviously, we'll play it by ear, but you can find out information on that workshop or that retreat at Heaven and Earth Workshops And again, the link is down below. I'll save the longer sales pitch for about that a little bit later on, but just make some room in your mind. If this is sounds interesting to you, Bali is just an absolutely amazing, amazing place to do this kind of work. And assuming that we are allowed to travel, it will be quite an experience. So, having said all that, and thank you for your patience, we now are going to jump into the astrology of the second part of May 2020. And all I can say is that, you know, it's been an amazing year, crazy year so far, one that we will certainly remember, one that astrologers have been talking about since the Saturn-Pluto opposition in the autumn of 2001. And it's not lost on me how people who know nothing about astrology at all, certainly especially the people in and around New York City, how the comparison keeps coming up between the events of September 11th, 2001, and this event, or this kind of continuing event, and how the two of them have such similar energies, even though the events are very, very different. And of course, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction opposition cycle here is certainly the culprit. However, we now find ourselves having taken another swirl around, as if we're stirring this stew or pot of soup. And now, just like when you're cooking a soup, sometimes things begin to stick on the sides or the bottom, and you stir a little harder. And sometimes it's almost like if you give a backward stir or two, that can really loosen things up. And that's where we are right now. The cosmos is giving the cosmic spoon is now stirring backwards over the past couple of weeks, and over the past few weeks, and over the past week in particular. We've had Pluto, then Saturn, then Venus, and then Jupiter all turn retrograde. It's not unusual for planets to turn retrograde. It is unusual for three heavyweights, and those three heavyweights would be Jupiter, Saturn coming into a conjunction later this year, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto all turning retrograde around within a week. Well, Pluto earlier. But the thing that makes this interesting is that Venus is right there in the mix. Even though it's separated by degrees, Venus has also turned retrograde. And in a way, the faster moving planet Venus in this mix personalizes these otherwise social, cultural, historic events. And so we're getting hit on two levels. One of them is these large-scale events that are affecting everyone. And obviously, if you look at the degrees at where these planets have turned, where they have gone direct, where they are now turning retrograde, in particular, the Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto from, let's say, mid-late degrees of Capricorn, let's say 20 degrees of Capricorn, through Saturn now at about 1, almost 2 degrees of Aquarius. And if you have planets in this range, then these events are affecting you even more than they might be affecting others. Let's face it, everyone's getting impacted by what's going on, but some people seem to work with the energies easier. Some people get hit square on, whether it's personal illness and or even illness or death of a loved one, whether it's a business situation, whether it's financial. People have different levels of impact. And the crazy thing about this experience is that although it's horrific for many people, there are many people who are looking at this as like an opportunity to shut down the outer noise and to go inward, to clean up the environment. And we have to be really careful about judging at one end of the spectrum or the other, because the fact of the matter is that people are experiencing it very differently. And so we just have to make sure that we don't take whatever our experience is and turn that into what everyone's experience is. Everyone is struggling on some level with what people believe that's different from what they believe. In other words, there are people who think that this whole thing is a government plan, the conspiracy to take control, that the virus is a hoax. There are medical people who think that we're handling the virus the wrong way. There are people who think that it's way more serious than we even know. There are people who, who are linking it to all kinds of complicated events that are all intertwined and entangled. And it's not my purpose here today to put credibility or to or to cast dispersion on any of these events. What we need to understand, however, is that the spectrums are being pulled wider and wider and wider, and so whatever issue it is that you bring up, you're going to find people who agree with you and disagree with you and create tension around what that belief is. But as soon as you bring something else into it, you're going to find that the boundaries are shifting, because the same people that might be supportive of this idea that you have might be supportive of an opposite position on something else. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this in, because this is setting the tone for the month of May, and in fact will be with us throughout the entire month. We began the month of May with Venus forming a square with Neptune. Now, Venus is in Gemini. Venus moved into Gemini back around the beginning of April. And then the beginning of May, Venus at about 20 degrees of Gemini squared Neptune at 20 degrees of Pisces. Let's bring a chart into this. Okay, so what we're looking at here is a chart for noon on May 15th. I'm recording this on May 15th, on Friday, May 15th, 2020. This is an Aries chart that I always use because the horizon has been taken out, because you could be anywhere in the world. And so we're just looking at the planets by sign and in aspect from one to another. We can see here that at noon, and this is Eastern Daylight Time, excuse me, we can see that the moon is at 7 degrees of Pisces, having just come across and lined up with Mars earlier today. Actually, it was late last night. But we can see here, and this is the important thing that I want to talk about, is the fact that Venus, which has turned retrograde, it just turned retrograde on the 12th, and Venus, having just turned retrograde on Tuesday, is making a square. You can follow this red line from 21 degrees 44 minutes retrograde, making a square to Neptune at 20.5 degrees. That's 20 degrees and 34 minutes of Pisces. So running this chart back to May 3rd, we can see that Venus at 20 degrees of Gemini is square to Neptune at 20 degrees of Pisces. Now, the reason why this is so significant, and I wanted to start here, is because when Venus is square to Neptune, normally it's square to Neptune for a few hours, for a day even. The energy might last for even a day or two, once a year or once or twice a year. And yet, because Venus is basically slowed down at the beginning of May, has not moved very much at all the way up through her retrograde turn on Tuesday, that Venus has been holding this square to Neptune, which turns it into something other than just an attraction or repulsion of something that's light and easy and a fantasy or an illusion or a desire or a turn on or something you want or whatever it is. Instead, because Venus is holding her position, it becomes much stronger and much more powerful. Now, Venus in Gemini is a bit fragmented. She's light and easy, and she likes different things. She likes information. She's interested, and she encourages us to be interested in anything that's new or different or exciting, or another point of view. We're interested in hearing different perspectives. We're interested in connecting with things that are not necessarily the only way to perceive the world. In fact, we're enamored with how different the different people see things. And so Venus in Gemini, again, would normally just whiz right through Gemini, but because of the retrograde, she's pretty much going to be in Gemini from the beginning of April all the way through the beginning of August. Venus is pretty much holding this position. And for a large part of that time, and for pretty much all of May, Venus squaring Neptune basically puts us into a state of confusion. Now, I've talked about how Neptune is aligned with the word confusion, but it's confusion because Neptune forces us out beyond our boundaries. Neptune dissolves the hard edges of Saturn. And so when Neptune is involved, we lose the boundary between self and other, for example. And if I can't tell where I end and where you begin, well, for the ego, that's rather confusing. And the word confusion actually means with melting together. Fusion is when two things blend and become one. Con is like, like a conjunction. It's at the same place or same time. And so the confusion here is that it's hard to tell what side of the spectrum some perception or some belief is. It's hard to tell what we like or what we don't like. In fact, with Venus being scattered and fragmented in Gemini, this Venus square Neptune that set the tone at the beginning of the month, and now let's bring this up to net date now, is that here on May 15th, we have Venus having turned retrograde, and Venus having turned retrograde and is already within 1 degree, or just about 1 degree of orb to that square to Neptune. But by the time that we get to May 20th, and there we are at May 20th, we have Venus exactly squaring Neptune again, as it was on the very beginning of the month, holding this position of us being confused by what we like or what we think is even real, or that what we believe that what we like is the truth or is real, but Neptune squaring it begins to create some doubt. We question whether or not what we're believing is actually true. And I think therein lies the undertone for the month of May. And of course, when we add the fact that we have 4 planets moving backwards, or apparently moving backwards in the sky, Venus, we have Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto, that there's this big swirl of energy kind of forcing us to go back and look at what we thought was true and wonder, maybe it's not true. Or maybe we dig in our heels even more and put up resistance, and we can try to convince ourselves that what we believe is true. And the fact of the matter is, we may need to open our minds and widen our perspective. And again, I'm not picking on any one thing here, saying that any one thing is true or false. I'm saying that this is ubiquitous. This is sitting behind everything, where we need to question what reality is. And with the planets turning retrograde, it makes it difficult for us to move forward very quickly with any sense of certainty at all. Now, I want to say one other thing about retrogrades before we move on and drill down, day by day or every several days for the rest of the month. What I want to say about retrogrades is something that those of you who have studied with me before have heard me say before. And that is that real planets, meaning the planets that turn retrograde, not the sun and the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, all the asteroids, all the centaurs, all the Oort belt planets or planetoids, all of these planets, when they get closest to Earth in their normal travels, we lose perspective and it looks like they're going backwards. They're not really going backwards, but they appear to be traveling backwards in space, which is why we read and hear and experience so much about retrogrades often as returning to past. For example, with Venus retrograde, there's a sense that often we revisit the past, whether it's in memory or in actuality, whether it's stirring up some old feelings or someone comes into our life from the past, or whether we simply put finality or go backwards to kind of put things into perspective, whether they're friends or loves, or whether it's dealing with money issues, that Venus retrograde often requires us to go back. By the same token, Jupiter retrograde often indicates that opportunities that we passed by come back, and it's almost like we get a second chance, and we can look at an opportunity from a different perspective. And maybe an opportunity that we took, now we're realizing maybe it's not so wise to move so quickly, or maybe an opportunity that we passed, we're now realizing, this might be a good deal if we just look at it in a slightly different way, and we have a different perspective on it. With Saturn turning retrograde, it's those structural advances, the rewards for the hard work that we've done, the things that come together, the goals that we reach may seem like we're backpedaling, or almost like we're heading toward the goals, but the harder we pedal, the further away they become. It's kind of like this weird dance that can be very, very frustrating, because it feels like we should already be somewhere and we're not. The flip side of that is that it may be that we came close to something, whether it was a few weeks or a few months ago when Saturn was moving direct, we came close to grabbing our golden ring, or putting something into motion, or making something happen, or getting acknowledged for work. And now that Saturn is turning retrograde, it gives us another chance to develop our idea, to fine tune it, to bring in more tools, so that when Saturn turns direct the third and final time and goes through that same area again, now we may be able to put the structure to the manifestation that we were unable to do earlier. And then the same is true with Pluto. When Pluto, because it moves so slowly, it often goes direct and retrograde and direct and retrograde. And sometimes it'll go back over the same point even 5 times, where it goes right direct, then retrograde, and then direct, and then retrograde. And so with Pluto, the rhythm is a little different, because that direct retrograde in some ways buys us time, so that the deconstruction of what is being transformed can be complete, because we can't ever move into the new unless the old is completed. And so when Pluto does its retrograde dance like it is now, it gives us, I was going to say it gives us an opportunity, but it's more like it forces us, unrelentingly forces us to take a look at unfinished business and to revisit what we thought was done, so that we can make sure that there is nothing left to the old that needs to be deconstructed in order for us to reconstruct or manifest what is new. So these retrograde energies are incredibly significant, and the timing here on these, Venus turned retrograde on Tuesday, on May 12th, and she turns direct toward the end of June. Does that mean no progress will be made now between now and the end of June? No, but it does mean that we can make ourselves a bit crazy and frustrated if we think that we're going to just be blasting ahead. And it would be one thing if just Venus was retrograde, but remember, it's Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto, and the outer planets go retrograde once a year for 4.5 to 5.5 months, depending on which planet they are. And so Pluto, for example, turned retrograde the end of April, and it doesn't turn direct until October 4th. Saturn, which turned retrograde this week on May 10th, on Sunday, it turns direct the end of September. And Jupiter, which turned retrograde on Wednesday or Thursday, depending on where you are on the planet. Thursday for most people, on the 14th. Jupiter turns direct on September 12th. So what this is telling us is that even if we make progress, it's not going to really be felt as a forward movement until we hit the autumn, until we hit to September, even September, October. And of course, in there we have a Mars retrograding in Aries, which is going to give another layer of stirring to this soup. Mars turns retrograde at the beginning of September, September 9th. And so again, I think we have to readjust our thinking so that there's no quick fix here. There's no, people talk about, oh, when are things going to go back to normal? There are people who are saying, no, this is the new normal. They'll never go back to the way they were. And anyway, the way they were wasn't even normal. But the point here is that we're being slowed down enough that it's going to take time for us to integrate where we're going to go next. We may have a couple of false starts, but this is a deep and powerful introspective moment that is being forced on us by the cosmos, by Mother Nature, by Pachamama, by Gaia, by the government, by ourselves, by our desire to live long and prosper. And so we're not just going to be able to go out there and just run forward with what we think is the next step, even if that makes the most sense, even if that's where, even if that's where the statistics and where the science leads us, it's still not going to be quite as fast. And of course, some of this may be not just our patterns of how we weave the physical patterns in the outer world, but also the economy, which may take or will take a long time to recuperate, if in fact it's going to recuperate, or if in fact part of this continuing retrograde series means that the economy and the structures of government need to even deconstruct even more. And so there's certainly been talk of, financial restructuring at various times. And I'm not saying this is it, but it's certainly a potential. So that really is what the second part of May is all about. But here we are on the 15th. We have the moon moving through Pisces. We have, remember, Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, and Venus all retrograding. But we also have the moon, which has just moved into Pisces. And as such, the moon is actually going to catch up with Neptune. It does that on Saturday, the 16th. And of course, when the moon catches up with Neptune, let's move this ahead a couple of, there we are. There's the moon close to being, this is for Saturday now, May 16th. You can see the moon coming into a conjunction with Neptune, but that also means the moon is going to be squaring Venus also on the afternoon, at least in the United States, on the Saturday afternoon. And so we might be tumbling down another rabbit hole of fantasy illusion, of hopes, dreams of something that's beautiful, and yet it doesn't quite match up with what our sense of aesthetics are. And so there is that exacerbation of that Venus-Neptune, which keeps getting stimulated and re-stimulated as the moon every 7 days, once a week. The moon, it comes along and it conjuncts Neptune, and then a week later it'll conjunct 90 degrees away, it'll conjunct Venus, and then a week later it'll oppose Neptune and square Venus, and then a week later it'll oppose Venus and square Neptune. And so this pattern keeps getting exacerbated for a few days, for a day or two, once a week right now, which brings that back again and again and again. Now, the other thing that happens on yesterday, today, May 15th, is the fact that the sun moving through the latter degrees of Taurus picks up on trines to Pluto, Jupiter, and Saturn. Now, understand that Mercury, which has whizzed through this area of the sky and is already in Gemini, that Mercury actually picked up on those same trines last week, as Mercury trined Pluto on May 9th, it trined Jupiter on the 10th, and then it trined Saturn on the 12th, that there was some sense of building stability behind all the craziness. And now on the 15th, we have the sun moving into a trine with Pluto, which is really giving us the ability to go deep. This is like, I'm not satisfied with what's going on the surface. I want to get to the bottom of this. And that sun trining Pluto really kind of helps us seat our energies and go a bit deeper. But in fact, the sun moves on and the sun trines Jupiter just a couple days later. And there's the sun at 27 degrees on Sunday, May 17th. And now the sun trining Jupiter is, all of a sudden we have this sense of hope. There's a sense of optimism again. And this is the same steps that we took when Mercury hit these planets in the same order. And so what happens here is that by the end of the weekend, we're looking like maybe there's some optimism, maybe there's some hope, maybe things are taking a turn for the better. And of course, all of this is very, very interesting because we really can use, that kind of energy. So that sun trine Jupiter on the 17th is significant. But another thing happens on the 17th, and that is that the moon moves into Aries. The moon moves into Aries, East Coast time, 9:35 a.m. So that's 9, 8, 7, 6:35 Pacific time. And this, in a way, is the resetting of the cosmic clock of the emotional cycle. The moon moving into Aries says, okay, let's do it. Let's go forward. And I think a combination of that spontaneous, impulsive Aries moon, along with the sun trining along with the sun trining Jupiter, I think that on Sunday and Monday, we're going to have quite a bit of optimistic and forward thinking. One little caveat is that Mercury on Sunday also forms a sesqui-square. That's a square and a half with Jupiter. That's not marked here. And what I think that's a warning that if we're too optimistic, if we take on too much, if we become too expansive in our thinking, or maybe even in our physical movements, we might end up paying the price, because by the 19th, that's Tuesday, the moon moving through the latter degrees of Aries, let's get that going. The moon moving through the latter degrees of Aries picks up on a square, and I don't have the moon aspects in here noted either, just for sake of simplicity. But on the 19th, the moon at 24 degrees of Aries picks up on the square to Pluto, and then the square to Jupiter, and then the square to Saturn on the 19th. And the moon actually moves into Taurus at about 10 o'clock p.m. On the 19th, so that at the beginning of the 20th, we have the moon in Taurus, which then that moon is forming that square with Saturn. So I think that this is a little bit of a harder energy. And even though the moon likes being in Taurus, the fact that A, she squares Saturn, and B, she comes into a conjunction with Uranus by Wednesday afternoon, that is on the 20th, that the moon Uranus might be a bit topsy-turvy and upsetting. But in all of this, we have another thing occurring, and that is that we are kind of done with the 30 days of the sun's move through stabilizing, simplistic, let's just kind of get it together, keep it together, focus on what we need to, Taurus. And on the 20th, the sun moves from Taurus into Gemini. And as the sun moves into Gemini, it's going to begin to pick up on a Gemini air sign, Saturn and Aquarius air sign, and the sun begins to pick up on that trine to Saturn that isn't exact until the 22nd, but we're already feeling it. And yet we're also getting the moon conjuncting Uranus, which is things are a bit crazy, things are, and the other thing is that retrograde Venus has now backed into the exact square to Neptune. So I think these are still all powerful days. Again, coming back to that metaphor of the soup being stirred, it's like there's big planets that the motion's going backwards to unstick the stuff that's being caked to the sides of the pot. And now at the same time, we have some like other lighter stirs going on in all kinds of different directions that I think make the period between now and May 20th kind of hectic. It's hard really to know which direction is going to be the final direction and how we should move through all of this stuff because it's complicated. There is a lot going on. By the way, on May 20th, excuse me, when the sun moves into Gemini, we now have the sun, Mercury, Venus, and the North Node. Remember, the North Node, which travels retrograde regularly, backed into Gemini back at the beginning of the month. And so now we get this whole Gemini fix of energy, but we have Mercury moving quickly ahead and Venus moving retrograde backward. And what happens is that right there, Mercury catches up with Venus. So there's a Mercury-Venus conjunction. Our intellect, Mercury, and Venus, our desires and what we want, we're able to speak clearly about what we want, except for one thing, and that is how can you be clear when Neptune is in there kind of encouraging fantasy. So this is we can give words to our fantasies and our desires, but it's still hard to discern in all of this what's real. And then on the 22nd, we also come into the Gemini New Moon. This occurs at 1:38 p.m. And here we have the exact chart for 1:38 p.m. with the sun and the moon, well, within a minute of arc, at 2 degrees of Gemini. And this is incredibly powerful because this new moon is trining Saturn. And I think that even though we have Mercury and Venus squaring Neptune, kind of spacing us out and making us unable to discern who's telling the truth and who's making shit up. We just can't, it's just not obvious because the truth teller one day is the deceitful person the next day and vice versa. It's not like we can just rely on the rules that we normally rely on because roles are switching here very quickly. And yet in all of this new moon, even though it's an airy, whimsical, changing, adaptable new moon in Gemini, it is in fact trining Saturn, which gives us the ability to, in all of the mix of all of the changing currents and tides, it gives us the ability to fix on something that is real. But we have to be careful upon what we fix, because that becomes really important. And if we pick the wrong things, we can end up having to have a very difficult time later untangling what we are now saying is the truth. Because remember, the truth is relative here. We have Mercury squaring Neptune. We have Venus squaring Neptune. It's not like the truth is hard to find. As crazy as this sounds, there is no truth. I think of Bob Dylan's line, "There are no truths outside the gates of Eden." In this world right now, it's almost like things in the unconscious being swirled around. Everything is possible. It's like a quantum reality where the vibrations are not fixed. And so we have to be very cautious as to what we fix on, because that will take on great importance over the days and weeks ahead. As we move onward, we have on the 23rd, and again, this is not noted either just for sake of simplicity. On the 23rd, we have Mercury forming a semi-square, a half square with Uranus. And this is a bit anxious. This is high nervous system energy. It's not so much uncertainty. It can be very innovative and very brilliant, but I always think of Mercury and Uranus as the professor in Back to the Future. And you never really know whether he's an amazing genius or whether he's just fucking crazy. You just, and so in a way here we're back to the same issue where there is innovation, there is potential that for absolute breakthrough, but it produces anxiety because we still can't tell, what it is that's going on. Now, as we move ahead, the moon over the next couple of days comes in contact with Venus and Mercury, and therefore it squares Neptune, again, running us through that whole fantasy reality check thing. And then on the 24th, late on the 24th in the evening, the moon moves into Cancer. And I think here the energy kind of settles down a bit, or we pull in, where it's like we're weary of engaging so much in the outer world, that as the moon moves into Cancer at 7:08 p.m. on the 24th, our energies begin to internalize. And in fact, Mercury forms a quincunx with Pluto. And I've just added the quincunxes back into the mix, but that's that fat green line where Mercury at 24 degrees of Gemini is making a quincunx with Pluto. And in fact, it'll make that same quincunx with Jupiter on the 26th. And then it'll make that same quincunx with Saturn, but not until the beginning of next month. At any rate, Mercury in Gemini is at home because Mercury in traditional astrology is the ruling planet of Gemini. We moderners might say that Mercury is the planet that is closely associated with Gemini. But Mercury likes its back and forth, its information. It's like the switchboard operators in olden times, where it's connecting this to that, connect this to that. It's like anything that uses fingers, like crocheting or knitting, where you're connecting things and tying things up into knots. It's information that's digital. It's the whole idea of digitization. And so Mercury in Gemini is really totally interested into getting information. However, its quincunx to Pluto says, Pluto is basically saying, you're just being distracted. You're running yourself ragged, looking for more information. You have enough information. Stop. Go deep. And it's not like one or the other is right. It's just that this kind of annoying, irritating non-relationship between how Mercury and Gemini wants to connect with anything and everything, everywhere and every when, and Pluto just wants to hold the position and do its work and deconstruct the structures where it's at so that it can rebuild it later on. And so there's a bit of an annoyance here. And again, this is on the 25th, but that Mercury then quincunxes Jupiter the following day on the 26th, where Mercury reaches 27 degrees and then quincunxes Jupiter. And now it's almost like there's too much. There's too much going on. It's almost like we want to yell uncle. And in fact, that's exacerbated by the fact that the internalizing moon in Cancer is coming into an opposition with this retrograde cluster of Pluto, Jupiter, and Saturn. And so we're being stretched again to whether we go in or out, whether we work internally or externally, whether we go back to the past for the truth or whether we push to the, into the future. Either way, I think that the 26th is it's a bit tense. Tense isn't quite the right word. It's anxious. We feel anxious on the 26th because we're not quite sure how we're going to resolve all of this. And unfortunately, when we get to the 27th, the moon moves into from Cancer into Leo right there. If I just move that ahead, even just an hour or two, there's the moon moving into Cancer. I'm sorry, moving from Cancer into Leo, actually at 2:32 a.m. early in the morning, Eastern time. And once the moon moves into Leo, which theoretically should be playful and creative and animated, this is outgoing, sunshiny Leo. However, the moon is now opposing Saturn. And so we again get this, how can I be fun and lighthearted and playful when reality, when the external is basically slowing me down or holding me up or giving me restrictions. And that moon opposition to Saturn actually occurs early on Wednesday morning on the 27th, but that energy may linger through the day, because as the moon continues to move through Leo through that day, the moon actually will reach 8 degrees, boom, right there. And later in the day, it will square Uranus. And so again, we have this whole dance between Saturn stabilizing, holding back, creating reality, giving us structure, and Uranus basically saying, no, blow it up, break the rules, go outside the lines, color outside the lines, whatever. Now, the other piece that's playing on Wednesday, the 27th, is the fact that Mars here in Pisces is making a semi-square that's a half of a square to Pluto. And again, the line isn't drawn in here, but this is 45-degree angle, one half of a square. And again, over the days ahead, Mars will make that same half square that it makes with Pluto on Wednesday the 27th. It'll make that same half square with Jupiter and with Saturn. And all of those half squares, it'll make the half square with Jupiter on May 30th, and it won't get to the half square to Saturn until June. But all of these are basically about slowing down and wanting to force forward. Remember, all the retrograde planets are preventing forward motion from happening naturally. It's like the rivers reverse. It's like the tides, are coming in when we're trying to set our boat in the water and go out. And so we can't fight these tides. They're too large. And into this whole this mess, comes this Mars half square to Pluto and half square to Jupiter, basically, I don't want to say punishing us, but basically making that Mars unable to actually be effective. Mars in Pisces has a hard enough time already, because it sometimes has a hard time knowing which way to go, because the waters, the murkiness, the Neptunian dreams and illusions make it so that Mars can't get its bearings really clearly. It has to go by intuition. Of course, Mars is the warrior planet, and Mars in Pisces is the spiritual warrior. But here we have Mars making this half square to powerful Pluto, and followed up by a half square to Jupiter. And this is Luke, close your eyes and let the force be with you. You cannot use the map to guide you. You can't just fold under the pressure of what's out there. That would be Pluto. You can't just take your confidence from someone who said something out there. That would be Jupiter. You can't just take Mars and fight against the rules just to take them on one at a time and fight against them. That would be Saturn. In all of these cases, there's this, Mars is not working if it engages those planets directly. And therefore, Mars in Pisces has to do what it does best. And that's close its eyes, go inward, and understand that the silence and the truth on the inside is basically the best guidance that we can have right now for knowing what to do on the outside. And so it's a very tricky time, and it's complicated, because the answers that we normally would get from just looking at the map, when Mars semi-squares Pluto on Wednesday the 27th, it's like we might feel like we're running into resistance, and yet the resistance isn't right directly in front of us, and we can't take it on, we can't fight back. And then when everything looks great, maybe a couple days later, when Mars makes that semi-square to Jupiter on Saturday, actually May 30th, it's again, we got to be careful about being misled by what's going on out there. We got to keep reminding ourselves that this is not about short-term resolution. It's not about making it happen moment to moment, although we need to certainly keep it together moment to moment. But there's something here about keeping that eye on the distant future and knowing that we're not going to get there as fast as we might like. On Thursday, May 28th, Mercury, which is at 29 degrees of Pisces and 53 minutes at noon. By later in the afternoon, I'm going to flip this ahead 12 hours. You can see that Mercury moves from Gemini into Cancer. Now, there's two things here that are significant. One is that while Mercury is reaching that very last degree of Gemini on the 28th, it's lining up with the North Node of the Moon, which means that our communication may have clarity from other times, other places, from our soul, from the past, from historical realms, from genetic realms, from past lives, that when Mercury lines up with the North Node, it's like giving us direction as to where we can go, and we can communicate the vision of what's ahead. However, Mercury is also coming into a quincunx with Saturn, and that quincunx to Saturn, let's just move that ahead, is right there on May 30th. Mercury forms that quincunx to Saturn. Is actually late on the 29th when it's exact. And once again, we have that same problem of Mercury now in Cancer. Mercury isn't necessarily saying everything now. Maybe it's insecure and it doesn't want to upset the apple cart. Maybe it feels like if it speaks, it will be rejected. Maybe Mercury in Cancer is convincing us that if we don't say anything, we actually have a better chance of taking care of our own needs and protecting those we love. Regardless, Mercury is bumping into Saturn, but not directly again, so it's hard to take it on directly. So we end the month with these quincunxes between Mercury and Pluto, Jupiter, and Saturn as all being a bit annoying. And then the other thing that comes into the equation here is that on the 30th, the Sun in Gemini makes that square and a half to Pluto. I started to mention that before. I don't remember whether I did or not, but the Sun's square and a half to Pluto begins its run of making that square and a half to Pluto. And then over the days ahead in early June, it'll make a square and a half to Jupiter and to Saturn. And so in each of these situations, we find planets, the faster moving planets, whether it's the moon or the sun or Mercury, Venus, even Mars, we find these planets kind of going through the scenario of hitting Pluto, Jupiter, and Saturn exactly in that order. First, going to the deep, the dark, the shadows, the hidden realms, the transformation, then seeing the hope and the potential and maybe getting an idea of where we can go with this, and then having to do Saturn, the hard work, the follow through, to take it slowly and with determination, making a plan, and then actually walking or executing the plan that we actually come up with. And so this energy is played through fractally again and again and again. Also on May 30th, Mars forms that half square with Jupiter. Remember, Mars made a half square with Pluto. We talked about that earlier back on the 27th, I think it was. Yeah, Mars made the half square with Pluto on the 27th. And it was like meeting resistance, but not being able to take it on directly. Now on Saturday, May 30th, Mars makes a half square with Jupiter. And this may be over exuberance. This may be, you know what, I'm going to just go out and run all kinds of errands. I'm going to take the kids to the playground. I'm going to go to the beach. I'm going to, get out in the world. I've been cooped up long enough. And we just need to pay attention that we don't go too much, too far, too fast, or we'll meet up with the other side of this when in early June, Mars makes that semi-square or half square to Saturn. That brings us up to the 31st, we go out on an interesting note. We go out, that is, the month goes out. The moon moves from Virgo into Libra, midday, actually late morning on the East Coast at 10:37 a.m. Um, but right around that period of time, and again, I don't have the aspects drawn into the moon, but as we look at that moon going through late Virgo, that moon is now going to harmonize or make trines to the planets, because Virgo is an earth sign. It's going to make harmonious trines to the planets in late Capricorn, earth sign. So on May 31st, this is a Sunday, at 1:46 a.m., middle of the night for some, in East Coast time. But the moon makes a trine to Pluto, and then by 5:15 a.m., again East Coast time, then the moon makes a trine to Jupiter, and then by 1:19 p.m., again still on Sunday, the moon will make a trine to Saturn after having moved into Libra. So this is all interesting stuff because it doesn't solve anything, but at least it tells us. And well, before I say what it tells us, the other thing here is that Venus is still in this wide square to Neptune, with Mars coming into the picture. This will be our story for next month, for June, or at least part of it, because then that eventually, it takes a bit for it to happen, but eventually that Venus will make a square. In other words, it'll go direct. Venus makes its third and final square to Neptune later in the summer. But the fact is that for all of May, that Venus is holding that position of, you don't know what's truth. You don't know really what is good for you. It's horrible to say, but even here with Venus backed up to 15 degrees, it's still kind of toying with this midpoint here, because Mars is coming in toward the square to Venus, and so that this whole dynamic is still playing through. And yet, as the moon moves into Libra, we get this sense of kind of being able to weigh and balance and put things into perspective. And at the same time, because the moon is harmonizing, trining the Pluto, Jupiter, and Saturn, I think we actually can end the month with a glimpse of maybe going into the next month ready to make it work, whatever that means, whatever we need to do. So, in summary, these are complex times, and you don't have to be an astrologer to know that these are, in fact, complex times. The fact of the matter is that the day-to-day noise of the moon and Mercury and even Venus retrograde making their angles, they're all significant, and they're going to pull our feelings and our emotions and even circumstances in our lives one way and then the other. But on the larger flow of events, we are caught in a cosmic riptide that is preventing us from going in the direction that we think we would like to go. And we need to have faith in the process, because the fact that we can't go the way we want to go as quickly or as immediately as we think we would like is actually what gives us grist for the mill, that we actually get to work this material around and around and around again, so that when we're finally freed to move forward, we can move forward with real purpose, with real clarity, rather than just going with the flow. I said at a conference that I was speaking at online this week that only dead fish go with the flow. Now, it's not completely true. There are times when going with the flow takes an act of consciousness. It takes strength to trust to go with the flow. But right now, even going backwards in a way is going with the flow. And it might be counter to what we think we want. It might even be counterintuitive, but the fact is that the cosmos is giving us a very clear message. And that message is, don't move forward as fast and hard as you think you want to. There's a reason why we're being forced to slow down. And those who actually slow down and learn that reason will benefit the most as the energies change later in this year. So that's it for now. I will see you all again shortly on my June forecast. In the interim, make sure that you do what you need to do to be safe on whatever level that has meaning to you. Just make sure that, as I say, I think I mentioned this story a couple months ago, that Ram Dass used to tell the story of of Muhammad allegedly saying to someone, trust in Allah and tie your camel. We can have trust in these larger processes. We can trust our intuition, but at the same time, it still makes sense to make sure that our camels are tied, that the things in our life that we can do to ensure our health, that we're doing it. It's just common sense. And so with all that, I leave you and remind you that thinking cosmically is very important because it stretches the mind outward. However, thinking cosmically by itself is no use to anyone or anything at all unless we also take those cosmic thoughts and then act locally. I'm Rick Levine. Be safe.